Ever wonder what it really means, like to truly know someone?
Yeah.
We're diving deep into the personality puzzle. And that question, I gotta say, it kind of hooked me right from the start.
Yeah.
It's like we're constantly sizing people up, making those snap judgments. But how much of that is, just scratching the surface?
That's the captivating thing about personality psychology, right?
Yeah.
It digs beneath those first impressions, goes beyond those gut feelings, and tries to figure out how and why we become who we are.
It makes you wonder, are we just a collection of traits? Like, is there a personality recipe card someone could follow, and boom, they're basically us? Or is there something more, something deeper, maybe even something a deep dive like this can't fully capture?
Psychologists have been wrestling with that question for ages. This book, it lays out all these different approaches they use, like they're giving us different lenses to examine this very human mystery.
Okay, I'm all about a good metaphor.
Yeah.
So tell me more about these lenses. How do they help us understand personality?
All right. Well, imagine for a second you're a detective. Yeah. And you're trying to understand someone's personality. You wouldn't just rely on one clue, one bit of information, would you?
No way.
Ah.
You'd want the full picture, right? Talk to their friends, observe them in different situations, maybe even peek at their browser history. Just kidding. Kind of.
Laughs, exactly. Psychologists, they do something similar. They use what we call data, clues, to piece together the puzzle of personality. Four main types: S, I, L, and B data.
Okay, let's break those down. S data, that's the most straightforward, yeah. Just asking someone directly about themselves.
Exactly. Self-reported data, questionnaires, surveys, that sort of thing. The upside, well, who knows you better than you, right? But the downside,
Sometimes we're not the most reliable narrators of our own stories.
precisely. We might have blind spots, or maybe we're just a tad generous with our self-assessment.
Oh, for sure. We've all got those friends who claim to be low maintenance, but in reality.
Yeah, not so much.
Exactly.
So-
So that's where iData steps in. Getting the outside perspective from people who know us.
You got it. iData is all about those who know you, best friends, family, coworkers, anyone who can offer a different angle on your personality.
So my best friend's assessment of my spontaneity, let's say, might be a tad different from my own self-assessment.
Perhaps drastically different. But those contrasting viewpoints, they're gold. They paint a more complete picture, even if our loved ones have their own biases, of course.
Makes sense. Okay, what about L data? This one sounds intriguing.
L data dives into the real world stuff, the concrete outcomes in someone's life. Think of it like the resume of your personality.
Okay, so less about what I say I'm like and more about what my life choices, my actions reveal about me.
Exactly. Have you moved around a lot, held the same job for years? Those decisions, they reflect aspects of your personality.
So it's like my likes is a personality test I didn't even know I was taking.
In a way, yes. And this data, it can be surprisingly telling. For example, research has linked conscientiousness, which is all about being organized, disciplined, with a lower likelihood of getting into car accidents.
Wow, see, that's a real-world consequence I wouldn't have connected to personality. Okay, last but not least, B data. What is that all about?
B data is behavioral data. This is where psychologists get to be those detectives in a more controlled environment. It's about observing someone's behavior directly, often in a lab setting.
Ah, so less tell me about yourself and more, let's see how you react when I do this.
You got it.
Yeah.
Think of those experiments where they measure things like reaction time to assess implicit biases, those unconscious associations we might not even realize we have.
That's wild. They're not asking directly about biases. They're creating a scenario to see those hidden reactions firsthand.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've got these four data types, these clues. How do psychologists actually use them to understand someone's personality? What are their go-to methods?
When it comes to B data, which is often collected in controlled settings, there are two primary approaches.
Yeah.
Experimental and correlational.
Okay.
Let's say we're trying to understand the link between anxiety and performance on, say, a math test.
Ooh, relatable. I still get flashbacks to high school exams. So how do those approaches tackle that?
With the experimental approach, we'd manipulate one of the variables.
Okay.
So maybe we create this super high pressure timed test for one group to trigger some anxiety, and then the other group gets the same test but in a relaxed, no pressure environment. Then we compare how they perform.
Right, you're deliberately tweaking the anxiety level to see the impact. What about the correlational approach?
Well, in this case, we don't try to control or change anything. We just measure both anxiety and math performance as they naturally occur.
Okay.
Maybe we give everyone the same test and use a questionnaire to assess their typical anxiety levels. Then we look for a link between the two.
So one is about actively testing cause and effect, and the other is about spotting patterns, links in what's already there.
Exactly. Both are valuable tools, each with strengths and limitations. And understanding how this research works, well, it makes us all savvier consumers of all that personality info out there.
Which, speaking of, all this talk about data and observation makes me think of personality tests.
Mm.
Are those another tool in the psychologist's detective kit? Okay, personality tests. We've all taken one, probably more like 5, or maybe even spent way too much time on those online quizzes that tell you what kind of bread you are, the ones. But like, how much should we actually trust these things? How much stock should we put in them?
Well, it's really important to remember that personality tests, they're not all created equal.
Okay.
And this is where those data types we were talking about, they come back into play.
Okay, yeah.
Remember S data, self-reporting.
Yes.
Most personality tests you come across, especially those fun online ones, those are built on S data.
So it makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
It's easy to ask someone a bunch of questions.
Right.
But then you're relying on them to not only be honest, but also to know themselves well, which, let's be real, isn't always a given.
Precisely. And that's where other kinds of tests come in. One's based on behavioral observation, B data. They give us a more objective look.
So if most of those online quizzes are S data-based, what's an example of a B data test that psychologists might use, like in a more formal setting?
One well-known example is the IAT, the Implicit Association Test. This test measures how fast people connect different concepts, like good or bad, with various groups of people.
Okay.
It's used to uncover implicit biases, those unconscious associations we might not even realize we have.
Wow, that's getting deep quickly.
Hmm.
So with the IAT, you're not directly asking about biases. You're setting up a task that kind of exposes those hidden connections, like a backdoor into our subconscious almost.
You got it. And then there are projective tests. You've heard of the Rorschach ink blot test, I'm sure.
Oh, the ink blots. Classic. What do you see in this ambiguous shape? It always seems a little mysterious, like something straight out of a movie montage. How does this actually work?
So projective tests, they're based on this idea that when we're faced with something ambiguous, our responses, they're going to reflect our deeper thoughts, feelings, maybe even those unconscious drives we don't even know about. So with the Rorschach, it's not really about what you see in those ink blots, but how you see it, you know?
Right.
What details jump out at you? What story are you building in your mind based on that shape?
So two people could look at the same ink blot, see a similar shape, but their interpretations, the stories they tell, could be wildly different.
Yeah.
And it's those differences that reveal something to a trained psychologist,
Yeah,
right?
precisely. And that gets to something super important about personality. It's not just our outward actions. It's also all that stuff going on inside that drives those actions.
Okay, so we've got our S data tests, our B data tests, even ink blots, and uncovering hidden biases. It's a lot to process. So for someone like me, not a psych major, how can I even begin to figure out if a personality test is worth my time? Like, what separates the good ones from the not so good ones?
You know, that's such a crucial question. And the answer, at least partly, is understanding a couple of key concepts:
Okay.
statistical significance and effect size.
Ooh, this sounded a tad intimidating.
I know they sound complicated, but they're really not that bad.
Okay, break it down for me.
All right, so statistical significance. Basically, it tells us if the results of a test, or any research study for that matter, are likely because of chance, random luck, or if they actually show a real effect, something meaningful. Essentially, is there something worth paying attention to here?
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's more to it than just statistically significant, yes or no.
You're absolutely right. Just because something's statistically significant doesn't automatically make it important in the real world. That's where effect size comes in.
Yeah.
Effect size tells us about the size of the effect we're seeing. How big is the difference or the connection being measured?
So a statistically significant result just means yeah, something's happening, but a big effect size means it's something important, something that actually matters.
Yeah,
right?
you got it. Here's an example. A personality test might find a statistically significant link between, let's say, extroversion and happiness.
Okay.
But if the effect size is tiny, it doesn't mean all extroverts are walking around overjoyed while introverts are totally miserable.
Right.
The difference could be so small that it basically means nothing in the real world.
That is a super important distinction. So a good dose of healthy skepticism is always a good idea when looking at these test results, especially those online ones, right? Those are often designed to be more for fun than for scientific accuracy.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in those personality test results, but we got to remember they're just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here talking about the science behind these tests, but I gotta admit, part of me still gets a little kick out of those personality quizzes, even if they're not, the most scientifically rigorous. Sometimes they can be surprisingly insightful.
I agree. They're fun, and they can definitely get us thinking about ourselves in new ways. And that reminds me of this concept the book talks about, self-monitoring.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. It's about how much we change our behavior depending on the situation, right?
Mhm.
Like, are you a social chameleon or more true to yourself no matter what?
Exactly. High self-monitors, they're those chameleons. They adapt their behavior to fit in, to match the vibe of the people around them.
Whereas low self-monitors are more consistent. What you see is what you get.
Precisely. And neither is better or worse. It's more about knowing your own social style. The book even mentions a self-monitoring scale to figure out where you fall on that spectrum.
Ooh, okay, I'm adding that to my to-do list after this.
Yeah.
Now, switching gears a bit. We've talked about all these data types, research methods, even personality tests. But what about those big picture personality traits? Like, is there a way to map out the whole landscape of personality? What are the core elements?
There is. It's probably a model you've heard of, the Big Five personality traits.
Right. Okay, remind me what those are again. It's like extroversion, agreeableness.
You got it. Extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. Think of them as the five basic building blocks of personality. We all have some of each, but it's the unique combination, the amount of each, that makes us who we are.
So it's not just, am I an introvert or an extrovert? It's more complex than that.
Way more nuanced. And what's cool about the Big Five is that each trait actually impacts how we navigate the world.
Yeah.
Like, studies have linked high conscientiousness with better job performance, for example.
Makes sense. Conscientious folks, they're usually more organized, reliable, all those good things employers love.
Exactly.
What about happiness? Do any of the big five traits connect to higher levels of happiness?
Research has found an interesting link between neuroticism and happiness. People who score high in neuroticism, they tend to feel more negative emotions, anxiety, worry, that sort of thing, and that can make it harder to experience those high levels of happiness.
So it's not that they can't be happy, but their tendency towards those negative emotions might mean they need to find happiness through different paths, right?
Exactly. It's all about understanding how these traits work together and how they shape what we experience.
Okay, so the big five, these seem pretty straightforward. But the book mentions some debate around openness to experience. What's the deal with that one?
Openness to experience is a tricky one. It's often linked to creativity, intellectual curiosity, even political leanings. But there's debate about whether it's really measuring intelligence, or maybe more about our upbringing, our cultural background, how we were raised.
So it's like that nature versus nurture question is playing out right there within the big five itself.
Yeah, it's an ongoing debate.
Now, speaking of change, do these traits, this personality recipe we're given, does it stay the same throughout our lives?
Yeah.
Or can we actually change our personalities?
That question has fascinated people for centuries. And the answer, it's complicated.
I figured. It's never simple, is it?
Right. We do change over time, though. Our experiences, relationships, our wins and losses, they all shape who we become. But there's also this core part of us that tends to remain pretty stable, especially as we get older.
So it's like, I'm not going to suddenly morph into a completely different person next year, but maybe I'll smooth out some of my rough edges or surprise myself by taking more risks as I go.
That's a great way to put it. It's a paradox, really. The book talks about this study where people of all ages, young and old, they said they wanted to change certain parts of their personalities. So it's not like we hit a certain age and go, well, this is it. I'm stuck this way.
I love that. So there's hope for all of us, even if we're a little set in our ways. What about those of us who actually want to change certain traits? Is there a research-backed strategy for doing that?
There is, and it might sound kind of backward, but it's not about forcing yourself to be different internally. It's about changing your behaviors first.
So like a fake it till you make it for personality.
Kind of. The book suggests if you want to be more extroverted, for example, start acting more extroverted. Put yourself out there, even if it feels awkward. Over time, those repeated actions, they can lead to real changes in your personality.
Wow. Like our brains are constantly rewiring themselves based on what we do, what we experience.
Exactly.
We really do have the power to shape who we become.
We absolutely do. And that leads us to another essential piece of the personality puzzle, Our genes and our environment. How much of who we are is set in stone by our DNA, and how much is molded by our experiences?
It's that classic nature versus nurture debate. So where does personality land on that spectrum?
The book delves into behavioral genetics, which looks at the role genes play in our behavior, including our personalities. And while genes are definitely a factor, it's not as simple as saying, well, I inherited this gene, so that means I'm destined to be this way.
There's more to it than that.
Way more. Genes don't work in isolation. They interact with our environment in these incredibly complex ways. The book uses the example of the serotonin transporter gene, or 5-HTT. It's been linked to things like emotional stability and how we handle stress. But here's the thing. Its effects are influenced by our environment, especially our early childhood experiences.
So just because you have a certain gene doesn't automatically mean you'll have a certain outcome.
Yeah.
It's how that gene interacts with our upbringing, our relationships, everything.
Exactly. It's nature and nurture working together that shape who we are.
Wow. This deep dive has been amazing. We've gone from data types to personality tests to uncovering the mysteries of our genes. And it's clear that understanding personality is a lifelong journey.
It really is. And as we wrap up our exploration of the personality puzzle, I think the biggest takeaway is this. Personality is complex, it's fascinating, and it's constantly changing. It's a field that's ripe for exploration with endless paths to discover.
So whether you're a total psych nerd or just starting to ask those questions about what makes you you, remember, self-discovery is a journey, not a destination. And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us as we dove deep into the intricate world of the personality puzzle. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration.